Okay, everybody, welcome to the first of my interviews this year on my YouTube channel. And I couldn't think of a better friend and colleague to be part of this than Dr. Nicolai Petro. As many of you know, he and I have had a number of conversations over the past couple of years in two of my undergraduate classes, post-communist transition in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, as well as a newer course that I teach on Russian foreign policy. Dr. Petro is still a professor of political science in the Department of Political Science at the University of Rhode Island. And recently, he has also become a senior fellow at the Institute of Peace and Diplomacy in Washington, D.C. His most recent publication, which came out yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, is titled "The Russo-Ukrainian War Enters Its Third Year, an Etiological Investigation." I will link the article in the description below once the video is up. So, Dr. Petro, welcome back once again. I'm sure we have a lot of things to talk about. Here we are on the second anniversary of the launch of the so-called special military operation in Ukraine. Given the events that have happened over the last couple of months, what would you say is the most important development that has come out of this situation most recently?
Well, the Ukrainians' loss of Avdiivka. Certainly that is being assessed in the West as a significant blow to Ukraine's military aspirations. I don't know enough about military planning and strategy to comment on whether that's accurate or not. But there seems to be a widespread consensus among Western analysts and Ukrainian analysts that this is a very big deal. And I can only imagine, as a layman, that it's because Avdiivka, the city, had been heavily fortified and was the rallying point for any expected assault that was to take place by Ukraine eastward in the direction of Donbass. And it had been fortified for years to serve for that purpose. So its loss leaves Ukraine bereft of a forward staging point, I guess, from which to carry out future operations for the liberation of eastern Ukraine. And the talk, again, which I'm only reading as any layman would, the talk among military strategists is, can Ukraine regroup now and create something along the lines of a defensive line that will halt Russia's advance? Russia is currently advancing, but there's maybe a few weeks from now, we'll look back and say the offensive began, sometime back then in February, after the fall of Avdiivka, which is, by the way, how they decided the Ukrainian counteroffensive of last summer. That's actually how it developed. It kind of began, and then people said, no, this isn't it. The Ukrainians denied it, and then they said, well, yes, that's when we actually began. So who knows? This is all, as McNamara called it, the fog of war, but it's a never-ending fog. There's no sunlight to be seen anywhere in these military events.
I had heard, and we're probably getting the same information from the same sources, but the official statement coming from Ukraine under its new, what would be his title? It's Sirsky, who would be
Yeah, commander. He's commander in chief of the armed forces,
right.
which is confusing because that's also Zelensky's title, but he is, I guess, operational commander.
Yeah,
Maybe that.
but he had said that he had given the order to make the tactical retreats in order to save lives. Maybe that was the case, but we've also been getting information that many of the Ukrainian defenders of Avdiivka had realized that they were unequipped, that they were not properly supported from Ukrainian military high command, and had decided that they were going to just up and leave anyway.
Yeah.
Is this sort of a way of covering that, or is there something else to be said about Ukrainian military supply lines not being as properly supported and connected to the front lines?
Maybe. This is the war is simultaneously an actual series of battles and deployments being fought on the ground. And it is also a virtual war of narratives that are proposed by multiple parties. The Ukrainians have their version of events, which is designed to promote the morale, to keep up the morale of their troops and their supporters. And the Western media narratives serve that purpose as well. The two strategies are linked and they are coordinated as they as NATO has often said, we coordinate with our Ukrainian allies
Mm-hmm.
in the media arena, and Russia counters that and has its own strategy to keep up morale and to um, diminish the morale of the opponent. So I've seen this strategy used as far back, at least, as World War One. In other words, we've known that this is part of the tactic of modern warfare, and it was used. It has been used in every conflict, at least since that time. In other words, since the time that the media became a part of uh, of military strategy and planning. Um, so the bottom line is no one in the midst of an ongoing conflict can be 100% certain about what they're talking about. And I suspect this would be even true at the very highest levels of government and the military. Because the information they get is the information very often that they ask for. It's hard for a messenger to bring bad news. It's a rare it's a rare function and a rare occurrence in large bureaucracies.
Mm-hmm.
To do so without the protection of being the designated bearer of bad news means that you are subverting your own career, and you are likely to be not invited to the next meeting. So it's very possible that there's not this will not come up,
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, people are planning always with incomplete knowledge. And only historians, the task of historians is to fill in these gaps through through the perspective that they have on multiple sources from a distance. But that's not for our generation. That's for the next generation.
Well, it seems somewhat paradoxical.
We simply don't know what's actually happening.
I was going to say, it seems somewhat paradoxical because we are, we're sort of told that, we won't know what we really will know until this whole war, this whole situation is over. And yet, officially, from political leaders in the US, the UK, the EU, they still seem absolutely steadfastly determined to defend Ukraine, ultimately see its entry into the European Union and NATO, defeat Russia, return to the 1991 borders. They are still, according to Lavrov, are still stemming any kind of negotiated talks over what he calls the Zelensky formula, which presupposes decisive victory from the Ukrainian side, and yet it seems paradoxical that throughout all of this, there just doesn't seem to be that much practical, on-the-ground support for Ukraine's proper defense. So the rhetoric is, we'll defend Ukraine until the end, and yet they've lost a strategic city, which, I think we need to, state for the record here, is not a major city like Kharkov or Odessa or Kherson, for that matter. But as you pointed out, it was a major staging ground for, years of bombardment of Donbass and a major military supply point for the Ukrainian forces. So, the press may downplay the loss of Avdiivka as just another irrelevant bombed out city. And yet, how is it that you can still say that you wholeheartedly support this state's territorial integrity as well as its military resolve by seemingly defending it on the cheap, defending it on a budget?
Emmanuel Macron made headlines this week by pointing out that very inconsistency and suggesting that it may at some point be necessary to send NATO troops officially into Ukraine. All that he is really doing by saying that is pointing out the obvious inconsistency in the policy, to which I think there is no palatable solution for Western governments, because the policy of supporting Ukraine, at least in the United States, as you know, is being sold as a cheap and profitable way to dismantle Russia. Cheap because we have the money, and from America's perspective, it is a small expenditure, and we're not losing that much. Well, we're actually gaining economically, because by imposing sanctions on Russian goods that are vital to Europe, Europe is forced to buy those goods and resources from the United States. So we're winning in that sense economically. And secondarily, there's the military budget itself, which we profit from. And again, our NATO allies buy from us that equipment. So again, we are winning monetarily. And as Victoria Nuland, among many senators as well, have said, all of this money that we're spending, don't worry about it. It's coming back into us. And what are we actually losing? Nothing. The Ukrainians are dying, not American soldiers. What a cynical and odious way to think about your allies, isn't it?
She also
And I
said
think,
she
go
also
ahead.
said that it promotes American jobs, right?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
promotes
And
good
this,
paying jobs in America. How's that? Good paying
right.
jobs in America while Ukraine burns.
Why we go to war? um, well, so all of this is ultimately good for the what we in America call the bottom line, which is our economic well-being. Um, the question is, and I think Ambassador Chaz Freeman put it well when he said, it was always NATO's strategy to fight to the last Ukrainian, and now they're running out of Ukrainians. And we don't want to substitute Ukrainians for, well, Americans. And it appears Americans, Germans, or British soldiers. Whether Macron can deliver French soldiers, I don't. The Poles have even said, no, we're not going to do that. So, you know, cautious, sober military analysts who are not in the business of promoting American military policy and American military industry, people like Douglas McGregor and Scott Ritter and Colonel Davies, I think his name is, and others. And although not military analyst per se, he spent 10 years in the military and writes about military strategy. John Mearsheimer have all come to the conclusion that this fight that Ukraine is undertaking is all but over. And the political leadership in the West is having a hard time coming to grips with that and catching up with that reality. So I guess the logical thing to desire, if you want peace, is for the military reality to catch up, I should say, the political reality to catch up with the military reality. It's very difficult to do in our context now, one, because all American politicians, either side of whichever political party you belong to, are on record as saying we will fight to the end, no cost is too great, and we're in this, for the long run. So they would have to explain why they changed their mind and why their assessment was incorrect. But secondarily, they would have to do this in an election year. And because of those two considerations, I see the issue of facing reality as being pushed off until November. We can avoid reality until November. We can just write a check. Maybe it'll be 60 billion, maybe 40 billion. It doesn't matter. The military analysts that I was calling sober have said it won't matter in the long run. So what we will do, rather than tackle the issue in a way that encourages diplomacy and saves lives, we will in fact delay that reckoning for ourselves until the Russian elections are over, the American elections are over, and we'll see how Ukrainian society responds to the fact that Zelensky has delayed indefinitely his own re-election, which is due this year, and the re-election of the parliament. So he has, the question of the legitimacy of him and the parliament being in office is also now becoming a political issue, will be after May. So all of those are coming to a head. And once we know, assuming what was likely to happen, that Putin will remain in office. In the United States, hard to say, but um, let's assume Biden ekes it out. At that point, he will have to make some important strategic decisions. And the beginning of a new administration is a good time to do that. He can simply argue new realities, etc. We're starting a fresh course. That's a common rhetorical maneuver that presidents do, even during their second term. There always has to be something new in America to strive for, to do, etc. All the more so if, in the, I think, unlikely event that Trump wins. That'll be even truer. And at that point, it'll also, we'll have to see if Zelensky is still in office or been challenged on that point as illegitimate for maybe his battlefield missteps, his faulty appointments, his continued corruption, and now he doesn't even want to stand for election. He's essentially become a dictator. This has become a series of common themes among prominent Ukrainian opposition figures, who are not in Ukraine, but they're outside of Ukraine, waiting, however, and speaking through the internet to Ukrainian society.
So speaking of November, the chatter is that if Trump somehow wins, Ukraine loses. Because of his statements, if I become president, I can end this war in 24 hours, which I doubt that he will. But there does seem to be, at least among the Trump Republicans, they're more vocally opposed to funding this war in Ukraine. They think that it's a waste of time and money. And there is now growing skepticism within at least the congressional Republicans, the House Republicans, in how much money is too much for Ukraine. And we need to also throw in this idea that now America's attention is focused on Israel and Palestine, in which, let's be perfectly honest here, there is near unanimous support for, by elected American officials, and both Democrats and Republicans, to give Israel whatever it needs and effectively fund and condone and diplomatically shield them from, any, what's the word here? Inconvenient
repercussions of their actions.
Yeah, pay the price for their actions. Whether you want to call them war crimes or genocide. And here's Zelensky effectively trying to remind the West, the United States, we're still in this. It's almost as if he's trying to keep last week's hashtag still trending. Is this something that you find within, your contacts with, Ukrainian media, Ukrainian circles, Russian circles, or they feel that there is somehow going to be a major breakthrough on the Russian side diplomatically if Trump wins? You might recall about a week or so ago, in a follow-up interview to the interview that Putin had given to Tucker Carlson, this was by Pavel Zarubin, who said something about, who would you endorse? Who would you support, Trump or Biden? And Putin immediately comes out by saying Biden, right? We absolutely support Joe Biden, which kind of elicited some kind of Joe Biden-y response from him. And then the follow-up to that follow-up was, hey, what do you think about Biden calling you, a crazy SOB? To which Putin seems like, yeah, well, that's exactly what we would expect him to say, but he's a far more seasoned politician. What do you think? Does he really believe that? Or is this one of those things where he's secretly saying, yeah, absolutely, we hope that this guy remains in power because he's weak and indecisive and he's a lot of things, but a loose cannon he is not?
The deeper context to all of this is that, as Putin has always said, we will have to deal with whoever is in office. And I'm going to add here a bit of my own interpretation, but we don't have to like it and we don't have to trust them. And I think that's what it will ultimately boil down to. I don't think America's politics is that important to Russia anymore. They'll do what they do. What the end result will always look like sanctions. Whatever they say, the outcome of their rhetoric will be sanctions. So that's predictable, and we know how to deal with sanctions. We've dealt with them before. We will continue to deal with them. There are limits to what sanctions can accomplish. We understand the sanctions game better than the West. We know how to play it more effectively. That's Putin's argument. And I think the Western financial institutions agree with him now. They're beginning to come around to the idea that not only sanctions per se are not effective political instruments, but that for large economies, and this was the experiment. We've had sanctions on small economies, and those have also, in all instances that I can think of, failed to accomplish changes in policy that we didn't like. Even those failed. But the assumption was that maybe we could impose a magnitude of sanctions on Russia that would, as an experiment, actually lead to the collapse of a major economy. It's an interesting experiment, social science experiment. But I think we have the results now. In 2 years, Russia has not only done worse, it has actually done better than its geoeconomic and geopolitical competitors. There is still the hope among sanctions advocates that, well, that may be true this year, next year, but you just wait. 5 years, 10 years down the road, it'll all look very different. Well, I guess we shall see. But the interim consequences are preparations for that future. The future doesn't come out of nothing. The future comes out of what has been accomplished in the interim. And in the interim, we have the shifting of Russia's financial networks. We have the shifting of major geoeconomic connections that Russia is encouraging, and that other major players, not the West, are willing to go along with, because they anticipate that they may be, and I'm talking about China specifically here, may be the next targets of the United States' ire. And so all of these long-term cards are, again, seem to suggest to me a major shifting in the balance of the global economy in ways that do not favor the West. And I think the West is simply too blinded by its own, the Greeks had a term, hubris, or pride. Hubris is actually an interesting term because it implies a blindness to your own faults, a blindness to your own inadequacy. And that's very true, I think, of Western politicians generally. Who do they talk to except each other? The G7, they talk to each other. Well, okay, maybe the G20, but not those people, not those people, not those people. And when they do talk, their natural instinct, the natural instinct of American politicians, is not to have a dialogue, but to lecture and tell other people what they need to do. And the rest of the world, I think, is now looking at events in Ukraine and looking at the Middle East and thinking about their own backyards and saying, if the United States succeeds in what it's doing, I mean, that's the natural extension of US ambition, is a military conflict. We don't want that here. The United States does not stand anymore in the world for peace and diplomacy. It stands for military victory and seeks to avoid diplomacy, as clearly we see repeatedly in the case of Ukraine. There's no one to talk to. We don't trust, we don't believe, so we can't talk to our opponents. But you have to talk to your opponents. That's the nature of diplomacy. So I think all of this, what's interesting about this is that this realization that the West is not in this for Ukraine's interests, but strictly for its own benefit, with Ukraine being the victim, let's say the beneficiary at best of this conflict between the West and Russia, or the victim at worst, is beginning to sink in to broader swaths of Ukrainian society. And then the question naturally becomes, let's negotiate before our entire society and country is destroyed. Something that the government of Ukraine has not been able, that conclusion has not been reached yet at the governmental level.
So I want to bring something in. This is not so much of another question, but just a talking point, because it just jogged my memory here. 2 years ago, when the invasion happened, the special military operation happened, Putin gives this speech explaining the rationale for the launch of the military operation, the recognition of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. It's a video that I translated. I put it up on my YouTube channel. It still gets comments. It still gets reviews. It's primary source material. And one of the things that he does, and it's sort of connected to his rather long, scenic route explanation to a question that Tucker Carlson had asked him about why are you in Ukraine, right? And it kind of generated some ridicule because it took him a half an hour to explain this, right? Where he's like, all right, in order for me to do this, we have to go back to the days of the, Varangian Rus, right? But what he is effectively saying is that as far as the narrative of Russian foreign policy is concerned, Russia has tried, take it as is, right? Russia has tried to be the honest broker with the United States and the West, not just since the collapse of the Soviet Union, but basically since the end of the Second World War. And that the United States, leading the West, has looked at Russia as something being the other, not Europe, not the West, and therefore not deserving of any kind of equal sense of respect. You just said before, right? The United States does not engage in dialogue, they engage in lecture. G7 talks to each other, and when we get to the G20, it's probably the G7 hanging out at the risk of having to deal with the other G13, at least, a couple of them. And so within this speech that Putin gave 2 years ago, he referred to the United States as the so-called empire of lies. He used that statement a lot, the empire of lies. He hasn't brought it up that much anymore, but he implies this. Lavrov also implies this, that the West, specifically the United States, A, cannot be trusted to meet its commitments, and B, even when they have agreed upon treaties, memorandums of understanding, and other signed legal documents, they just simply renege on them, they ignore them, right? The big thing with the Ukraine situation is the Minsk agreements, the Minsk Accords is being completely ignored. to the point where it was revealed by Merkel, by Macron, and by Poroshenko on 3 different occasions that there was never any intention of implementing Minsk, but it was a way of buying time, stalling, and allowing for Ukraine to militarily arm itself in line of some kind of takeover, in line of some military incursion, which, unfortunately, the reality is that whenever there is some form of disputed territory, whether it be Nagorno-Karabakh, the Donbas region, Abkhazia, even Kosovo for that matter, you either make nice with the people that control the territory, or you use the military as a gamble of trying to take it back. And if you take the military back, if you use the military to take the territory back, there's no need to negotiate. One other example of that is Operation Storm in 1995. The Croatian government, under the leadership of Tudjman, had initiated a military incursion into Krajina. Of course, Milosevic pulls his forces back, so it's an absolute takeover. The point here is that Russia seems to have come to the conclusion that there's no point in talking with the West anymore, because even if we get them to sit down, they're eventually going to renege and just do their own thing. Hence the reason why Russia has made the decision to do what it does, knowing that they're going to get the ire of the West. They will be castigated and demonized as the spoilers of international peace in a rules-based order, a rules-based society, but they just don't seem to care at this point. And they also seem to be banking on the collective frustration among many other countries that the West is, in fact, this type of patronizing, elitist group of countries that thinks that the global South, the rest, as opposed to the rest, can't think for themselves and can't treat equally with that of the West. And so, I guess it's more or less just an observation that I have here, because I'm thinking about this as I'm speaking, and I'd like to sort of hear your thoughts. But, it's something that we tend to forget when assessing Russia. I think one of the other problems that many in the West had with Tucker's interview with Putin was that he was allowing Putin to effectively say whatever it was that he wanted to say without checking him, without putting him in his place. And then as such, Tucker is almost seen as being pro-Russian. He's enabling Putin to talk. I've been translating these videos. I've been doing these things on my YouTube channel now for 2 years. Putin had said absolutely nothing new if you've been following for the last 2 years. There's nothing really new that comes out of this. In fact, it was largely just, a recap. But the fact that Tucker's channel has millions of subscribers, I only have about 46,000 or whatever. It reaches a larger audience. And yet it almost seems like the most controversial thing that happened was that Putin was given the opportunity to speak without being completely censored, edited, or openly demonized. So the worst thing that he did was just effectively give Russia's point of view of this whole situation to an audience that has largely been cut off from that. And I think the worst risk that comes out of that is that there will be a lot in the West that, at the absolute least, don't disagree with him. What do you think?
Well, right. I think you're quite right. And this reminds me of an essay that a close confidant for many years of Putin's, Vladislav Surkov, wrote in February of 2020, called The Loneliness of the Half-Breed. In February of 2020, he suggested that, by the way, he was the deputy deputy head of the presidential staff. Surkov argues that Russia's epic quest to join the West is over, and that for the next several centuries, Russia is destined to endure what Surkov calls geopolitical loneliness. It's a very fascinating article. He's since written another very interesting piece in early 21 called Deserted Democracy and Other Political Wonders. Both of those are interesting to pick up on. But he basically lays out what can now, I think, be understood as the shift in Kremlin thinking regarding the West. And if I were to interpret it, the speech that you so ably translated, what I take from it is the following, that indeed there is no more hope in the Kremlin that the West, that Russia can negotiate membership in the Western alliance. That dream, which, to remind everyone, the prospect of NATO membership was raised by Russia 4 times, beginning with Yeltsin and reiterated by Putin, but always rejected outright. Not let's start a process, let's set up a commission, let's think about how to accomplish this. No. It was rejected outright by NATO officials as well as the President of the United States. So that is no longer held out as a realistic prospect. But at the same time, what Russia sees as necessary and in fact inevitable is that Russia should be able to negotiate coexistence with the West. The West may be in decline as Russia sees it, but it still exists. It still exerts through NATO and the United States enormous military influence, if decreasing economic influence. The world is shifting in many ways, but the United States and its NATO allies still play a significant role. And as I think I read somewhere, some Kremlin spokesman said the task before Russia is specifically to negotiate a peaceful decline of the West, to, if you will, reintegrate the West into the rest of the world, which is moving in a different direction now. So there is this opening that Russia says needs to be encouraged, but it needs to be not based on preconceived values, which the West has of its own moral supremacy, as opposed to the more backward regions of the world from the West perspective, but rather that coexistence must be premised on practical interests that can be negotiated. And there are many out there in the world, starting with the need to prevent overconsumption, climate change. There's plenty pollution of the oceans. There's plenty of issues that require cooperation and that would benefit all of us living on this planet. And that's the arena to work in. I think Russia believes, Russian analysts, for the most part, believe that they are, as President Obama would put it, on the right side of non-Western nations, believe is a better, more peaceful, and more prosperous multicultural future, away from the old Western model of unipolarity and hegemony structured around the not just the primacy, but the supremacy of Western values. And that's a fundamental shift, I think, that has occurred and been reinforced course, Russia's invasion in February 2022. Russia, of course, sees itself as having been forced into this situation. But at least I gathered from the Tucker Carlson interview, from other things that Putin has said, this was not the first time in the Tucker Carlson interview that he used the word civil war in Ukraine. But I think he also acknowledged, or at least I heard, the intimation or the understanding that this is really a civil war that has been unleashed within the Slavic community, or at least the former Soviet Union. This is a painful, devastating process of regeneration that Ukraine is being forced to undergo, and Russia is being forced to undergo, and Belarus is being forced to undergo. And part of the difficulty in coming to terms with it is precisely that it is debated. Look, historically, everyone knows in Russia, everyone who went to school understands that Russia is a European culture. It has looked and considered itself part of European history since the Byzantine era. Thinking about Russia differently now, even as a Eurasian power, has yet to take root, has yet to be widely acknowledged. There are significant swaths of the Russian intellectual, Belarus, obviously, intellectual community who still believe that no matter what politically, no matter what happens politically, we obviously are rooted in Western values and Western culture and Western religious, the religious traditions of the West. Judeo-Christian tradition, which we blithely call the Western tradition, but of course is a Middle Eastern tradition. So, and at some point we will have to come back to that. I don't know. I certainly won't live long enough to see that. But Russia, I would say I have to agree with Sergei Karaganov on this point, and I think now as well, to some extent, with some of the younger scholars associated with the Council on Foreign Policy and Security, that Russia has for too long neglected its Siberian caboose. And I mentioned this several years ago, I guess 5 years ago now at least, that it was, I believe, Lomonosov, the founder of Moscow State University in the 18th century, who said that Russia's greatness will be manifest in Siberia. Because at some point, that wealth, that entirely additional world of resources and opportunities that is Russia's patrimony will have to be used by Russia. The whole world needs for Russia to use it and to use it for the benefit of all mankind. And I think that that is becoming more and more the deeper thinking of what is Russia's long-term mission for the world.
So, there's two other points that I wanted to bring up, and you can pick which one that you want here, because I was going to ask one, but just this discussion about Russia's role as a Eurasian power is yet to really be decided. They see themselves fundamentally as European. They root their history within that of Europe. I mean, it's abundantly clear. European history has regarded Russia as one of the five great powers of the continent. there are also times when this question is fielded to either Putin or Lavrov, and they kind of say the same thing. They say that there are people in Europe, there are political leaders in Europe that truly are representative of these traditional European values that don't simply go along with the multi-culti liberal democratic element of the EU, which they see as reaching a point of moral and intellectual poverty. For example, Viktor Orban, Robert Fico, Alexander Vucic, among just three individuals here, which of course is going to immediately create a reaction within the Twitter sphere, saying, well, of course Putin likes these three guys because they're conservative, they're authoritarian, they're illiberal Democrats, birds of a feather, flock together here. But, I can't help but notice that there is a growing number of admirers of this type of vision of Europe that Putin or Russia seems to be thinking about, right? Traditional Europe, as opposed to more postmodern, more post-cultural Europe. And there's always going to be a number of these within conservative, right-wing, national populist movements, but it's clear that the missing cultural dimension within European statecraft has been a risky liability for many liberal democratic parties. It also explains why anything on the political left never really goes anywhere. It just doesn't seem, aside from just simply, chanting the same slogans about what we need more in Europe is more Europe, which I don't know what that means. And it just kind of goes to, it's like, I'm sorry. I mean, I have to kind of, get on my soapbox here, but when I hear some statements from Borrell or von Leyen, from Scholz, from Baerbock, from Macron, I'm just like, I'm sorry, but I try to be objective, and I understand that they're coming from where they're coming from, but it's like, this makes absolutely no sense. It also belies almost this idea that there is a sense of denialism within this part of Europe, that they are somehow losing the argument, or that they're losing the credibility among the rest of the world. I mean, Borrell's statement about the EU being this garden and the rest of the world being a jungle, it's picked up by people like Lavrov. It is used over and over again as a way of emphasizing that there is, one group of people in the world that still see themselves as morally, intellectually, politically, economically superior to everybody else. And if nothing else, Russia's ace in the hole is its foreign policy, if we can consider this to be soft power within the developing world, within the global south, is that Russia will treat you, insert country that you want, more equally and with a greater sense of respect for your own cultures and identities than the West will. I don't know if this is going to create necessarily a counter ideology to that of the liberal democratic West, or is it just going to create a collection of doubters and naysayers? But the second point that I wanted to bring up, and it's somewhat related to this, is that last week we all heard about Alexy Navalny dying. And my first thought was not surprised, but my second thought was that this is more of an inconvenience for Putin than any kind of benefit, because most people had forgotten about Navalny. He was in prison, say what you want about that, but this was, of course, picked up in the West by many people who I have to say have been silent about a lot of things going on in the world since October the 7th. And now suddenly they have something to talk about. And yet I really begin to wonder whether Navalny was, if he was a symbol, if he was just some kind of optimism among younger Russians that there is an alternative to Putin, or whether Navalny had his moment, but just kind of became a little more than the champion for Western liberal democracy in a country where it just wasn't going to, not going to take place. anytime soon. So, your thoughts on
There's a
all of
lot of,
this?
yeah, that's too wide ranging
Yeah, you can pick
for me
one
to think
here.
about. But let me start at one idea, reaction I had to what you said about European values and traditional European values. The thing that the current political elite at the head of most European countries seems to have forgotten is that they there are other constituencies in Europe. Not everyone agrees with them and their party. And this neglect and dismissal of alternative points of view by people who were themselves elected democratically to uphold pluralism and diversity of values and the rule of law within their countries, this utter contempt and dismissal of their own citizens and often their rights to assembly if they happen to disagree with the point of view of the government in charge, I think will be manifest in the next round of elections. Many people suggest that what they call the right wing, and they call this in order to tar it with a negative connotation. But in fact, what they refer to as the right wing is simply anybody but the current government. And we see this manifested in German politics by this very unusual and as yet unproven new political alliance, the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, so the Alliance for Sarah Wagenknecht, a left-wing politician willing to engage in negotiations with the right. Because the ideology, she says, no longer matters as much as the fact that there is a consolidation of power among the current elite that is crushing all of us and crushing dissent itself. Now, if that sentiment takes hold and becomes popular, it may well become, for a while at least, unstoppable. And that's partly what we're talking about with the Trump phenomenon here. There are a lot of people who think Trump is unreliable, crazy, egomaniacal. But how can you vote for the current government? How can you vote for the Democrats when their trajectory is clearly to suppress any dissent? At least we don't know that we know how bad it is currently and likely to get worse under the current Democratic administration. With Trump, we don't know. There's the hope that he may at least not be as repressive domestically. And there will certainly be a constituency that is out to get him that I think is unlikely to be shut down. So we will, in fact, have increased pluralism and increased diversity of views. We will have the official Trump narrative, should he be president, and then we will have the rest of the media and opposition providing their narrative, which is probably not the worst outcome, again, for political pluralism. So my suggestion is this alternative Europe may be the new Europe. Although I would add one caution. Giorgia Meloni, when she was elected, was supposed to be the avatar of that new Europe. And if you look at the distribution of votes for her alliance, which was a right-wing alliance of right parties on the right, it was so striking and so overwhelming in Italy for the first time that it united North and South, precisely because it was a vote for change. But then she didn't change. She went along with the old trajectory and did everything that she was told by the European Union. And I think that is going to hurt her as well. So I don't know. We shall see. Maybe I'm seeing too much into the rise of alternative political parties, and then we will simply continue on our current course.
You know, the way that I see it,
definitely appealing. Putin is definitely appealing to this group, but there's no one he can deal with because no one is yet at his level, except for Orban, Fico, and Vucic, as you mentioned.
yeah, yeah.
That's in Europe. The rest of the world really doesn't have the same problems as European politicians do.
Well, you know,
but we're likely to see, I think, more of those rather than less of those potential Russian allies in the future. And the political and economic consequences of this are hard to predict, because we know that in NATO's past, we had military scenarios like Operation Gladio being arranged and reviewed by NATO in the event that a country should wish to undermine or leave the alliance.
Mm-hmm.
And then this Operation Gladio would intervene should in this case it was the communists, should they take power, to essentially prevent that from happening.
Mm-hmm.
I assume, given the stakes, that the same policies are being considered for Europe in the future now.
You know, I
guarantee the survival of this of NATO in its present expanded form.
Mm-hmm. So I was wanting to mention this possible, maybe not an alliance, but sort of a convergence of collective grievances in Germany between, Wagenknecht on the left and AfD on the right. I mean, those that believe in horseshoe theory are going to have a field day if it comes to this, and basically say that, extreme left, extreme right are kind of the same thing. As we all know, in a country like Germany, it's a parliamentary democracy, which means that may happen just in terms of collective grievances against the political center, but that may cause that may create grounds for an endless grand coalition between CDU, SDP, and heaven help us, FDP, just to the traffic.
CDU and SPD.
Right.
The problem is we had 5 such coalitions, the Grand Coalition, and the SPD wisely decided we cannot appeal to our voter base if we are always going to be the junior partner in a coalition. We have nothing to distinguish ourselves.
That's right.
That is the bane of being a centrist party, which is too close to your opposition. So they have to be something different.
Right.
That is still a problem for them. It's hard for them to distinguish, particularly in foreign policy, but even in domestic policy, why one should vote for the SPD instead of the CDU. And that's where the two extremes offer a real alternative. Because what has happened now is the other members of the coalition, that's the Liberal FDP and the Greens, or the alliance of the Greens, as they call themselves, are also indistinguishable in their actual policies. So they've simply reinforced the middle, meaning status quo, that Germans are increasingly dissatisfied with, especially in foreign policy. But how important is that, and is it enough to empower the periphery of the political system.
Hmm.
Um, Hard to say, because what would have to happen for that to take place is a real war scare. I think I've mentioned like a long time ago, and this has come up in discussions before with other analysts. You know, the Cuban Missile Crisis, as long as it remained a crisis and not an actual war, was actually a good thing. The silver lining was that after the crisis, people said, phew, now let's get down to negotiations.
Right.
Okay? Let's have a hotline. Let's make sure we have regular visits, summits, things like that. So we never get to this situation again. That would almost be an ideal outcome for the current situation. But I don't see a way to get there without a real war scare, much more intense than we've seen so far.
Yeah.
Macron's doing his best, I must admit, by saying we should consider sending NATO troops into Ukraine. He's done his part. Thank you for that. But the rest of his alliance has nixed that, and so we're left to see Ukraine's corpse bleed to death.
Yeah. Yeah. So one final question, and I want to tie this all.
I want to get back to Navalny later, but
yeah, well, I mean, if you want, I mean, any thoughts on Navalny?
Well, my one and only reaction is the one that I have at hearing the death of anyone, which, in Russian we have a saying, may the kingdom of heaven be his. All things should be forgotten and forgiven when someone dies, be it your adversary or your friend. They've gone hopefully to a better life. He tried to accomplish much, and he was less successful than he hoped. We all have our demons. We all have our foils. It's not the right word. Foibles. Our foibles. He certainly had his share. I don't, because the movement that he headed was about him personally. It became highly personalized. His death basically brings that movement, as he conceived it, to an end. Does that mean the end of Russian liberalism? No, it does not. Russian liberalism, as I describe in my book, The Rebirth of Russian Democracy, written 30 years ago now, has a long history going back well into the 19th century. And those ideas remain because they have a certain place in Russia's political culture. At times, that place will be more prominent. At times, it will be less prominent. I'm not at all surprised. Every political analyst will say that when a country is under siege, as Russia is or sees itself to be currently, this sort of domestic dissent is frowned upon and suppressed. It happens everywhere in the world. As we know, it happened in the United States routinely. But that doesn't mean that movement is gone. It will reemerge again and again because it is part of Russia's multifaceted political culture. And it would behoove us in the West to be aware of the multiplicity, the complexity, the multifaceted character of Russian political thinking, of Russian political culture, because if Western liberals are ever to find their counterparts who will last in Russian politics and Russian political discourse, it will be those who derive their liberalism from within Russia's history and Russia's political culture. And that's where the meeting of minds between Russia and the West can actually take place.
So this is actually a nice segue. This is really the last question, the last issue that I want to talk about now today, because this fits nicely into something that you have been discussing for a while, and that is, are we reading Russia right? Title of one of your papers. I think it was last week you were on the Duran, and one of your co-guests, your co-speakers was Glenn Deason, who wrote this book Russophobia, which I recommend everybody to read, to get their hands on, because I think it delves rather nicely into the sort of the pathological thinking in the West about Russia as being this super other, the antithesis to Western civilization, and the idea that it would be impossible to fathom Russian liberalism as a part of its own culture. That someone like Navalny or someone like the Yabloko party or Russian liberal thinking is somehow nothing more than an anomaly, a small little flash in the pan, when in fact this has been part of Russian political thought since, Peter the Great, one would even say. So I guess the question, or at least the thing that I would like to maybe just get your thoughts on, we can discuss this just super briefly here, is this idea of, is Russophobia, I think, ultimately one of the underlining things that is preventing this kind of dialogue from between West and Russia. We talked about the hotline that's set up after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was sort of seen as a breakthrough. It's almost taboo for anybody in the West now to speak with Putin or Lavrov, right? This is a country that is one of the major powers in the world, and yet the West has effectively done what it always does when they don't like a country. We just don't talk to you. We don't talk with Cuba. We don't talk with Syria. We don't talk with Iran. We don't talk with North Korea, and yet we wake up every morning angry that they still exist. Kind of the same thing with Russia these days, is that we want Russia to go away. We want Russia to see the error of its way. We want to restore peace in the world, but yet we don't want to do it while even including Russia, or including even their own sets of grievances. NATO says we do not impose membership on other countries. We will simply not turn away those countries that want to join. Except Russia, which could have solved a lot of issues. This could have solved a lot of issues way back in the day. But if NATO says no to Russia, then they have to say no to Ukraine. Because if you say yes to Ukraine and you say no to Russia, I mean, you're basically begging for a war. You're begging for a confrontation. And then when Russia responds, the West plays victim. Almost as if, two couples that are fighting, they go into a marriage counselor, and the marriage counselor says, "I don't want you to tell me about anything about your marriage prior to you walking into my office." And that's kind of the Western response to how we got to where we are in Ukraine. Once upon a time, Vladimir Putin woke up one morning 2 years ago in February in a very, very bad mood. He had just a horrible hangover or a nasty headache, and decided that the best thing to do would be to invade Ukraine, which was kind of sitting there and doing absolutely nothing. And NATO was just taken completely aback by this. So, I mean, a lot of this, unfortunately, I have to say, within the 2 years that I've been, looking at this and teaching political science or whatever, I have to say that, it's not a cop-out to say it's all Russophobia, but it is clearly a type of Orientalism that, dichotomizes.
Now you've gone and done it.
Yeah, I know.
Orientalism.
Oh God, here we go. We brought in Saeed. That's it. I'm done. I'm either going to get hired or I'll never get a tenured job in academia ever. One of the two. One of the two. But it is a type of Orientalism which has done more harm than good, as far as the West is concerned.
Is there a question here? I'm not sure. I mean, I agree with what you've said, Is the question, what can we do about it?
Or is just like Russophobia somehow just permeates the entire way in which established political thought
Well,
operates?
yes. Well, and it starts with culture. I mean, the politics is an extent. The politics we conduct is an extension of our cultural assumptions, which are rooted in our values assumptions. And when our foreign policy is about value, and we, as a matter of principle, raise the issue of the so-called values gap between Russia and the West, without being able to specify what that gap is. And if we did begin to describe it, then we could indeed at least debate. There could be a debate, and then out of the debate could come, well, what do we want to do about this? On which points can we narrow that gap, and which points can we not? So the intention of raising it, that very phrase that Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was so fond of, the values gap, the insurmountable values gap, and then never defining it, was a way of essentially keeping Russia in a box permanently without ever being able to engage with the West. What can be done?
Что делать?
Yeah. Well, education, the kind of discussions we're having, especially engaging with people who are on the periphery of our point of view, but not wholly committed to the idea that Russia is evil. In other words, people who say, well, I can see your point on something. And those people, I think, should be actively sought out so that we can engage in a dialogue and broaden the understanding of the complexity of Russian society and Russian political culture and Russian history. And I'm not obviously not just talking about Russia, I'm talking about Ukraine, all countries, but Russia in particular, because we take such a jaundiced view of Russian history and political culture. So it's probably not very useful to engage people who say, well, Russia good, Russia bad, West good. What else do you need to know? As I heard one official say at some point. No, those people are not interesting or useful to talk to. But at some point, we have to hope that someone with more appeal than Donald Trump says the things that Donald Trump said during his electoral campaign, which was, I don't see why we can't be friends with Russia and China. Not a deep philosophical dive into anything. He just said, well, you tell me why we can't. That question, the very question, aroused such indignation and furor that it led to an entire government, I have to say it, entire government conspiracy to take him down. That's how scared the current establishment is of discussing the possibility. So I don't know whether such a person can emerge or who that might be, but I would note that beyond the bipolar system that we have in the United States, Democrats and Republicans, the other candidates who were popular, in particular Robert F. Kennedy, who is running an independent campaign and receives, I don't know what percentage, but it's at least in the double digits in terms of popularity. And Vivek Ramaswamy, who may still be in the running for the vice presidency or in any Trump administration's, I hope, some position of authority. Those are also people who are asking the same question and are trying to answer it as well. You don't have to answer it by saying Russia is good, the West is bad. That's equally simplistic and wrong. We all have our faults. And maybe that's a good point to start a dialogue. We all have our faults. And if I can see my faults, then maybe I can forgive yours. That's all. Let's just start the discussion from there.
You know, here we are 2 years into the war. We're talking about moving beyond that, engaging with Russia. We haven't even discussed, and we're not going to, how this war will end, because I honestly don't know. I don't see right now any kind of path forward. I remember you were a guest in my Russian foreign policy class last fall at Fordham, and my students were asking me, how do we move forward from here? And I just said, right now I don't know. I honestly don't know. I think that the first step that we would need is to get to where we have what you just described, and that is we at least need to be able to willing to speak with Russia on some kind of practical level. The other thing that Trump did, I'm no fan of him, but the other thing that Trump did that was so scandalous, that was so treasonous. Remember, he went to North Korea and spoke with Kim Jong-un. And, this was just before we were about to get involved in World War III because of what he was tweeting about Rocket Man or whatever. But suddenly they go and they meet, and that was actually even more scandalous than him calling him Rocket Man.
Just
Twitter.
Imagine engaging in diplomacy. I mean, diplomacy is becoming the dirty word now.
Yeah.
Well, in certain social media circles, put it that way.
Right.
And we need to call that out. We need to say, we need dialogue and diplomacy precisely with those whom we disagree with, precisely with those we think are our enemies, to understand what their grievances are, not to concede, not to agree that we should, do what they want, but at least to understand where they might come over to our side, where they might be willing to negotiate. Because the only alternative to dialogue is death.
Yeah.
Is mutual assured destruction. Another phrase, by the way, I'd like to see come back into our political terminology today. Yeah. It had a sobering effect on the political mind in the 1960s. It would be good to have that element of sobriety today.
I think, Mearsheimer, who has become somewhat of an academic rock star in the last couple of years, Mearsheimer has been writing about the same things now for over 30 years. He was kind of like the last stalwart realist out there, and now he's finally getting his I told you so victory lap. But, the problem with...
People hear the word realist, and they think, like military or something like that. And they can't even understand him half the time, because he is a classical realist.
Classic realist.
He says, you really need to understand and negotiate with your enemies, because otherwise it is perpetual war. And you can't have that. That's not what realism stands for. So you seek not hegemony, but a balance of power in international relations. Mm-hmm. People go, what?
Yep.
And that is realism.
Yes.
That's what we teach in 80% of our courses. That's the mainstream thinking. And yet somehow we've lost sight of that, guiding star in American foreign policy that used to be our be-all and end-all, and we've replaced it with a crusader mentality.
Well, liberalism, effectively. You have an ideology where you believe that you are morally correct, you are morally superior to others. If you decide to sit down with Russia, with China, with Iran, with the Palestinians, you are now a cop-out. You are now a sellout.
A religiously suffused liberalism, not the type of liberalism that a David Hume or a John Locke would have talked about, which was on the basis of reason and the finding of mutual interest negotiated between the parties. We've replaced that with, again, a crusading spirit.
Yeah, I think that's actually a rather good point. Crusading liberalism, which just creates, one problem after another here.
Sure.
You know what? Let's talk about that at another point. I think let's talk.
We're not going to solve all the world's problems.
No, not now. No, not now, Rod. I think that a time span of about an hour and a half here with this discussion was enough for the. Yeah, it was enough. It was enough. But I think we
the time flew by. I hardly noticed.
What do you know? Look at that. But let's pick this up again at some point. I'm here in Tashkent until the end of May. Maybe I'll move.
As am I here in Kingston.
Rhode Island versus Uzbekistan. Let's. I think you've got a little better seafood than we do.
No, I see some advantages to be, where you are. The cuisine.
The cuisine is phenomenal. Don't get me wrong. Uzbek food is just some great stuff here. Maybe I'll move the desk around a little bit more so I can get the view of the Tashkent skyline.
Your background. You have black curtains. And
yes.
It's a little daunting that you have black and white right behind you.
It's, the previous apartment that I had that typical Soviet era wallpaper pattern on the wall. And with the type of lighting that comes from the ceiling, if I sat there, I'd look like I was some kind of Chechen warlord issuing ultimatums. So I'm like, I need to just kind of make the aesthetics here look a little good. Black curtains and whatever does the job. Does the job. It's minimalism, black T-shirt and everything else. Anyway, Dr. Petro, thanks once again for coming to my channel, discussing. We'll pick up in about a month or so, see where everything is. But again, the links to the readings that we mentioned are going to be in the comment sections below. I'll email you right afterwards as a reminder of if you have links to them, I'd be happy to put them in my page.
So just so you know, the very latest stuff is. I put it up on my website immediately.
Okay.
So under commentary or under videos, right? They're all right there.
Okay, I'll put all the links with titles in the comment in the description below, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay.